Good morning, colleagues, and happy to see you back in the room and online for this last day of a very inspiring conference. I must say, I was very eager to listen to the many contributions the last days as far as I could, and of course impressed by the discussion yesterday afternoon with Thomas Piketty. And of course, we had a brief overview of his book, but I must say it was well reading and even studying, because it's a lot more than what we heard yesterday. But what we would like to discuss today is exactly the problem of inequality, which is titled as for which a lot has to be said. But I think we don't start from scratch, and I would like to give a short overview of what has been discussed and where we start with this problem of inequality. Interestingly enough, we heard yesterday that there is a steady move towards more equality. So the perception of inequality is still there, but we have now the figures and the evidence that we are moving since decades towards more equality. And one of the reasons why, or the grounds why we are doing so, is of course accumulations of initiative, and we heard yesterday quite prominently that it's due to a progressive taxations. And here I think we got this message, but the other part which for me was clear is that progressive taxations did not hurt the wealth, the growth dimensions, and that this has lead also to more productivity. So I think this is one element we have to take on board. The second one is, of course, that this move toward more equality is due to the rise of welfare state, and in particular, the point was made yesterday, the investment in education. And the last one, which is for us key as trade unionists, is of course that all of that would not have happened if we would have not mobilized and fight for those development, and in particular towards milestones that we have to anchor in legislation, so that it's binding for all, and that is also linked with sanctions in case of violations of the rights of workers and trade unionists. So I think this is in a nutshell, where we start with. Despite that, what we have seen and what we have experienced within a very short period of time, 2020, 2022, is of course the rise of inequality, especially due to two crises, the pandemic one and of course the invasion of Ukraine. The pandemic one was clearly inequality in the access to healthcare, and I think this is something that we all have experienced throughout 2020 to 2021, especially, and in particular access to the vaccine. The other one, what we have seen, is the gap, the increased gap in terms of the working conditions and in terms of the fragmentations of the working class between those who are essential workers, those who are not essential workers, those who have access to telework, those who have not access to telework, those who have seems to gain out of the crisis in getting more jobs, being in the healthcare, potentially too much to do, but also those put as riders, for example, to deliver what we needed indeed to survive the pandemic. But here the working conditions were also not appropriate, to say the least. And I think here the move towards self-employment for those workers, and of course the high risk they carry, is of course dealing or leading to the precarizations of their situations. And here two dimensions that are key and that we will discuss today with our speakers is, of course, who are those who have indeed suffer or are still suffering from inequality throughout the decades, but in particular also these inequalities exacerbated through the two crises. And one is, of course, the issue of gender. One category of society, being women, have suffered quite a lot. The others is, of course, as we know all, the youth, so the people or the young worker and the worker having jobs that might be riders or jobs to be able to finance their study, for example, were cut from one day to the other. We could also add migrants. So here the panel of today will indeed look at those category of workers who have suffered or are still suffering quite a lot of inequality, exacerbated by the pandemic. And we will also look at what kind of investment is needed and what kind of cost the non-investment in those categories will impact the European Union. And yet, of course, what we would like to look at is the cost of inequality. And I would like to recall that, of course, the cost of non-Europe, which is something that the European Parliament has clearly developed throughout the years, is exactly that. We have to act, and we have to act in particular for those categories. And this is one dimension which has been presented as a gender transformative investment. And clearly here, the aim is of course to mainstream the universal access to protections amongst other, but also to make sure that no one is left behind, which is a very famous quote from Ursula von der Leyen. I'm very happy to welcome today very prominent speakers, and I would like to present them briefly, introduce them briefly, and then hand over to my colleague Sotia. Sotia will be the first speaker here, Sotia Theodopoulou. She's head of unit of European employment and economic and social policies. She's working at the ETUI, and she will give you a short briefing of what has been discussed in parallel sessions throughout the 2 days, to give you a flavor of where we are in the discussions and what is next. We will hear Ivalio Calfin, and I'm very happy to welcome him. Hi, Ivalio. Nice to see you again. Ivalio is Executive Director at Eurofond. Eurofond is the European Foundation for the Improvement of Working and Living Conditions, and here, of course, very involved in the research dimension on the dimension of the cost of inequality, in particular when we will look with Ivalio to the need, so the persons not in education, in employment, or in training. We will move then afterward to Nabil Hamed. Nabil is head of executive strategy and communication at Oxfam International, and is also the lead authors of a very important report, flagship report on inequality kills. And I think this is also a statement, and we are very much eager to hear your views on how to make sure that inequality is stopped so that it does not kill, as you say. I think it's a very strong statement. We will move on to Karin Schiele. Karin is director of the European Institute for Gender Equality, another agency of the European Commission. It's the only European agency focusing on gender equality, and I think here the gender dimension will be quite prominent. And our last speaker will be Emanuela Posen. She's a senior specialist on gender equality at the ILO. So here, a very prominent panel of intervention today to give us a hint of the cost of inequality. Without further ado, Sotia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Isabel. Good morning, everyone. So as Isabel mentioned, I have been asked to report to you from several panels in the so-called research part of this ETUI, ETUC biennial conference. The panels that I will report from have covered diverse topics with impacts on various types of inequality. Just to give you an idea, I will talk about a panel that had to do with the digitalization in organizing work and employment, the organization of unpaid care work, the exposure to work-related psychosocial risks and other occupational risks, such as carcinogen substances, the reception and integration of refugees, especially flowing from the situation, the war in Ukraine, to the existence of wage gaps across firms, the function of minimum income schemes, as well as the policy of the European Central Bank and the functioning of the stock market. That's a very wide variety of topics. At this point, I would like to thank all my colleagues who organized and chaired these panels, and for all the input they provided to me to make this report, and for also giving me the opportunity to get an idea of what was discussed, as it was not possible to attend all of them as they were running in parallel. So to try to organize a little bit the rich and diverse information that I received, and a common angle through which I will try to report to you some of their findings is the question of what kind of costs does inequality create for societies. So the costs that emerge or can be inferred from the discussions and the reports I received are economic costs, health costs, including mental health costs, costs from the waste in human capabilities and skills, especially for women, younger people, and migrants, refugees, and also political and social costs. Some of the mechanisms that were discussed are in fact likely to lead to multiple costs along this dimension. So some of the phenomena or the policies that these panels debated did not just create economic costs or waste and capability, but they had multiple dimensional costs. So what I would like to do is to illustrate these different categories with more specific examples from what has been discussed. So coming from the panel on digitalization in work and employment organization, costs reported had to do with isolation, fragmentation of work content and employment, the intensification of work and increased surveillance, the deregulation of working time that can spill over to non-work time and become less predictable, influencing work-life balance, the increasing load of unpaid work necessary to access and perform paid work, the delinking of formal education and qualification from skill requirements of a job, especially so for more vulnerable categories of workers. And then we also had increasing polarization between place-bound workers working from the employer premises and platform-based or remote workers. So as I mentioned, you can see how these different consequences from the digitalization of in the organization of employment and work can have multiple costs that may impact on the use, the maximization of capabilities of workers, their mental health, the work-life balance, and so on. Coming from the panel that looked into the unpaid care work and the inequalities it creates, the gender inequalities it creates, it was reported that the higher burden of unpaid work that women face, especially during the pandemic, has been affecting their health and well-being, as well as their career prospects, where again we can say that we can have not just economic costs because talent and human capital is wasted, but also the cost of their capabilities, the skills they may have acquired through education, and have an impact as well in their lifetime earnings and pensions, which may well result in poverty in old age, which is quite an even more difficult type of poverty to address, as there are fewer options for reintegrating older women into the labor market so that they can earn a living. Moving on to more occupational health and safety topics, the psychosocial risks and the exposure to dangerous substances. Evidence has been strong that work-related psychosocial risks impact workers' health negatively. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about deteriorating mental health, even before the pandemic, but especially so during and after. And of course, the reason why this has been happening has to do with increased work intensity and job insecurity. There are, of course, human costs related to psychosocial risks that have to do with long-term illness, family members having to provide informal care, and also economic costs. There was an interesting reporting from this panel that for the first time there was a price tag that was presented in terms of these costs. And it was based on on an ETUI 3-year long study. So it was reported that the total cost of just one disease, which is more specifically coronary heart disease, attributable to 4 psychosocial work exposures, and that's just 4 of many more in the 28 member states of the EU in 2015, was 11.4 billion euros. That's just one small fragment of exposures and diseases. So looking into wage inequalities between firms, it was also reported that women tend to be more segregated, and are more likely to be found working in lower paying firms as well. And this is also the case for migrants, which again suggests that wage inequalities emanating from the firm level have to do with have economic but also waste in terms of capabilities and skills costs. And then looking into the panel on the integration of refugees and migrants, the costs having to do with political and social instability and tensions were reported, namely the way that refugees have been integrated or non-integrated, and the pressure that has been created on relatively scarce, given the increased demand, public services may lead to these political and social tensions, where there are risks of further rise of the extreme right. Tensions concerning the services offered by the welfare states, education, social protection and assistance, healthcare capacity as queues, especially in some member states that have been receiving a large number of refugees. In the current situation, the demand has increased substantially, but the supply of public services has not followed suit. And again, there are issues about skills mismatch and waste in the labor market, as well the potential for exploitation and wage dumping. I'm not sure whether I have time to go through some policies that have been 2 minutes. So some of the policy options that have been discussed in order to deal with these costs could be summarized as giving more voice and access to labor rights to workers, especially the platform and the remote workers, make sure that they have equal labor rights and equally loud voice as their colleagues that work from the employer's workplace. There was some discussion about the importance of the economy of well-being approach. So effectively moving from prioritizing just economic growth and GDP towards emphasis taking more into account the impacts on health and well-being as a key outcome, a guiding principle for shaping economic policies. When it comes to the impact on women from unpaid care work, a priority is the establishment of affordable and adequate state provision of care services, and also not just the redistribution of care responsibilities between men and women, the rebalancing, but also the rebalancing of the burden of care, of the responsibility of care between families and the state. The care of children or elderly relatives should not just be a question between who does what at the household or family level, is it the men or the women, but also to what extent does the state take some of these responsibilities from the hands of the family, provide some relief in this respect. Of course, combating gender stereotypes regarding care, organizing work patterns to reflect the fact that care is a socially valuable activity that all workers should have the chance to undertake, recognize it perhaps as an intermediate input for other activities that are more productive and are considered to produce more value added in the economy, without care, however, would not be able to be performed. And then regulation at various levels. I think I'll stop here.
Okay, well, impressive colleagues. I think we can thank Soteria for this
and my colleagues.
much impressive.
And my colleagues,
of course, your colleagues.
Who did very good reporting.
You're the voice of your colleagues, but also the voice of giving us a flavor, I would say a very comprehensive flavor of the discussions, the richness, the diversity, but clearly also the solutions ahead of us. And I think this is indeed the big picture out there. So I would like to give 5 minutes for the room and the colleagues online, if you want to ask questions or make comments to Soteria, because I think it was so rich that you might want to have some clarifications or two questions from the floor. Yeah, please. A short input so that Soteria can reply. You get a mic right now.
Thank you. It's working?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. My name is Michiel Odijk. I'm a member of the Dutch Education Union. I like very much the emphasis on the differences, the different aspects of how we suffer from inequality. But I would also like to emphasize that there are some bases of discrimination that are hardly mentioned during this whole conference. That may be because there hasn't been a lot of research about how, for instance, the crises affect elderly people, or how the crises affect LGBTQI people. But I think it's important to keep in mind that there are different bases of discrimination, and that we need to include everyone in our concerns. Thank you.
Thank you for this input. It's not because we have a focuses today on gender and the need. I found that acronym a bit strange, but that we are not looking at the others. Clearly not, and I think you're very right. We should look at other categories.
We talk about families as
of course,
heterosexual
families. Exactly. You're very right. There was another point or another question in the room. Was it? No. Oh, okay. Online? No. Okay. So we'll thank you again very much, Soteria. I think we are very much looking to the follow-up of this conference, because I think here it was a very rich report, and of course looking at the solution ahead of us is important, and it's what we would like to look with you, Ivailo, and I see you on screen. So happy to have you on board today. And much looking forward to your input today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Isabel, and I would like to thank also ETUI and ETUC for organizing, for choosing this topic for the biannual conference, because indeed we very often speak about inequalities, but we need to be a little bit more instrumental there maybe, and to look not only at the societal cost of the inequalities, but also at this concept of growth beyond the GDP. And Sutiria mentioned that is the GDP the only measure of progress? And certainly it is not. It has to do with quality of life, it has to do with cohesive societies, it has to do with number of other issues besides, of course, GDP, which remains important, but not the only one measure of advancement. Looking at inequalities, I'll try to focus on recent research and provide you some data from recent research of Eurofound, which was done during the COVID period, during the lockdowns. We started with an e-survey back in 2020, and it was repeated every 6 months. So we have some trend and some information what happens around Europe. We also collected the data, and I'm going to speak a little bit on a project on the survey on the working conditions that since we started before COVID and then we had the lockdown, we finalized with telephone interviews, but we collected extremely interesting data, and there will be a publication which is under preparation at the end of the year. I'll try to use this new research in order to provide you some additional data about how this crisis affect inequalities. And at the end, we calculated, we have developed an instrument some years ago, and we refreshed the calculation on just one example, what is the cost of the society for the needs that are considered to be the ones between 15 and 29 years old. To go, I'll come later to the needs. Before that, I would like to start with a general observation that we have, and this is that basically inequality, the best way to fight inequalities is to prevent them. So it is very good to know what are the underlying reasons, so what are the developments in the economy, in the society, that additionally create inequalities in our societies. That is why it is very important to know that the processes that we witness during COVID and afterwards with this high inflation now are additionally boosting some aspects of the inequalities that we know, including by gender, age, social groups, etc., etc. Again, to give you some examples of what we have from the research, you have different factors increasing inequalities, and this is usually what happens during crisis. The thing is that inequalities is not a natural phenomenon. Usually they are subject to public policies, and they could be modified or mitigated by the public policy. So to look at the factors that additionally boosted some inequalities, I would go to some examples. For example, during the COVID period, we have seen a very big difference of the workers by type of employment, by type of contract. And we have been, this is the data of this survey that I mentioned, which is going to be published at the end of the year. We looked at the types of occupation, like permanently working on the employer's premises, working from the employer's premises and at home, self-employed, working only at home, self-employed with some dependent staff in the company, etc., etc. And what we can see is that when it comes to predictability of earnings, we are going to see that the indefinite contracts, which is not going to be a surprise, but in the indefinite contracts, gave 67% of certainty against 16% in the self-employed. We have seen also that people that work on the premises, and these were mainly the production sites of employers that could not telework, that could not go back home, and that had to work from the premises, have a higher wage uncertainty. They have lower expectations and worse perspective for the career development, and they have higher expectations for termination of their job. So this job insecurity was very much visible, especially in the professions that couldn't adapt to the lockdowns and couldn't be done online. And speaking about the size of this group, this is about 80% of the workers that didn't have the possibility to continue working either on some furlough schemes or from home. Another parameter that we very much see during the lockdown and the COVID period, this is the effect on youth. And this is very much talked. We went into details and tried to see why youth is more affected by the lockdowns. And here are the results. 56% of the young people were working before the lockdowns, either on temporary or short-term contracts. And you can imagine that these were the first contracts to be terminated when there is an economic downturn and an economic crisis. Then many young people are working in the hospitality sector and in the performing arts sector. Again, these were the sectors that were mostly affected when lockdown started being there. Even those that were able to go home and to telework from home experienced a much higher level of stress, and measuring the stress levels of the different type of occupations, the teleworking being very much wanted, and also after COVID, and I think this is one of the forms of work which is here to stay. Still, it created more stress, and in particular for young people, and in particular for young women. And there are reasons for that, and the reasons are related to more difficult access to housing, lack of social public services that could eventually bring and help the unpaid work at home, problems with managing the time with children. If we take the figures for the lockdown periods, the unpaid work, which is the work for taking care about children, about home, etc., went to 49.6, nearly 50 hours for the women with children per week, and this is more than the official working time. So you can see that for women with children, the practical working time doubled during the COVID period. Without children, it was the additional, instead of 50, it was 8 hours, which was much less than children. So the care for the children is extremely important, as we see, in order to give more time and more space for the work-life balance. Then, of course, we are going to listen now. I'll leave the entire topic of women and gender to Caroline, because she has an excellent research on that and excellent work. But just to mention that the working conditions also very much affected women working during the COVID time. And we have seen, and this has to do with the type of occupation. Most of those that were able to telework and that are still able, I mean, the jobs that are teleworkable, are occupied by women for one or another reason. On one side, this potentially provides better conditions for making a better balance between work and private life. But on the other side, we see and we witness increased levels of stress because there are a number of issues that need to be addressed with teleworking, which have to do with long working hours, have to do with health and safety conditions when working at home, has to do with increased stress, increased intensity of work, etc., etc. So if these issues are not addressed, the benefits from hybrid working and remote working, and women are mostly affected by that, are going to be very much not visible. Then we see that the two transitions that we are currently, and these are on the top of the agenda of the European Union, which are the digital and the green transition, also have a very clear impact on inequalities and creating different conditions for inequalities. For example, the digital transition, which is anyway happening. This is a bottom-up approach, and the public policies are adapting to the digital conditions, including to the digitalization at work with either automation or digitalization or the introduction of artificial intelligence. We see a series of problems there. Here we see people that are falling behind because of lack of skills, but also we see that in the different age groups, it is a different approach and a different adaptability to the changing conditions. And now we see what is dangerous now is the speed of the change, not that much the change. I mean, usually workers adapt to the change, but the speed of the change is something which creates challenges, especially for workers that are at a higher age and approaching retirement age. So we see that the digital transition affects very much the workers by type of occupation, by age, by including new forms of work. And we see the platform workers, for example, where the precarious work is extremely seen. I mean, it is very apparent, it's very obvious that you have it there. And again, let's see what European decision makers and legislators are going to decide on that. But this is creating a new type of work. I mean, the digitalization is creating new types of work, and these new types of work affect very differently the different groups, again, by gender, age, different particular groups, and LGBTQ plus were also mentioned in this. I mean, I could speak about other groups, urban, rural societies. I could speak about single parents that have their own problems, etc., etc. You are going to see that this different effect goes into different parts of the society. The green transition is also something which is going to create additional risks for inequalities. And I would just like to mention, we had a publication last year with the European Environment Agency on the measures that are taken by the governments normally to stimulate the green transition. And you would see that mostly the measures are directed to the people with medium to high income. So if you have some benefits for buying an electric car or insulating your house, you first need to have a house to insulate it. Then what we see is that there is a huge group of the society, mostly with lower income, medium to low income, that are going to pay a much disproportionately higher price with this if there are no additional mitigating measures for that. So we see that also the green transition, which is supposed to be top down, which has to have the support of the public in order to happen, needs to be very much adjusted. Not to speak also about the regional aspect of the green transition, which is also going to create a number of differences. So it's not about skilling and reskilling, which are very important in the green transition, but this is about the quality of life, this is about the adaptability, this is about the regional development and the possibility to develop properly the regions where this transition is made. So we see that these major processes that go in Europe, being the crisis or being the tops of the agenda of the policies, have an additional influence on the expanding and creation of the different inequalities. This can be solved. And now I would like to show you very shortly a
Very
calculation.
quickly, Value, if you can.
Sorry.
Very quickly.
Yes, this is very
watching
short.
out of the
Yes,
time.
I'm aware. Very short. I would like to ask to show just our calculation on the needs, where we did this calculation 10 years ago, and now we calculate it again. And we did a similar one for the gender gap. So maybe Caroline would mention that. But the question is, what is the cost for the society of inaction if things are left as they are? And for example, the example of the needs is very much speaking. So in order to calculate that, we take basically the loss of productivity if we assume that needs are not active, they are not working, and they are not producing additional value. They are not paying taxes, and on the other side, they have a cost for the society for the different social policies that they can receive. If next slide, please, you could roll. Yes, so we have economic and societal costs for the needs. 10 years ago, when we calculated that, please press forward. I mean, the slide is not full. We calculated that both the economic and the societal cost of the needs in Europe the cost of it amounts to 141 trillion euro per year, which is more than 1% of the EU GDP per year. By the way, things have not changed very much over the last 10 years. And if you further go with the slides, please, thank you. We see this calculation for the next years after 2011 that we made. So basically 1.6 trillion per year have been lost from the cost of needs. So when we think what would be the cost to stimulate, to create incentives for these people to go back to the market, it's going to be much less than that. And the last slide that I would like to tell, this is by country. You see that for some member states like Luxembourg, Netherlands, the cost of needs is very low. But for some other ones like Romania and Bulgaria, this goes to almost 4% of the GDP. So this is just one of the inequalities. And the needs here I mentioned, we include people between 15 and 29 years old, but you can imagine that the inactive people are much more than that. We have 50 plus people, we have people with disabilities that cannot be active, we have other parts of the society. So as we can see, the cost for the society, even if we want to monetize, the cost is much higher than if actions are taken and if inequalities are mitigated. Finally, I think that one of the instruments to deal with that is indeed the industrial relations. And we have a number of evidences in the research of Eurofound that wherever you have a representation and wherever you have a good social dialogue, you have much better results. By the way, the last research we made was on the national resilience and recovery plans. And it's very clearly seen wherever the social partners take part in that and are consulted, you have much more solid and good results, and the society is much more united and committed to make the changes. So again, inequalities are there. We need to talk about them. One of the ways to do this is to include the society, social partners, NGOs, and larger groups that could partner with the governments on that. Thank you very much, Isabel.
Thank you to you, Ivalio. I think it was a very interesting presentation, I think you stress very much the key functions of the labor market for the social inclusions and the social cohesion, of course, and the importance of it, while at the same time clearly showing us that there is here a lot to be done in terms of reducing the social costs of not having been able to include those categories of persons in the labor market, let alone the fact for them that due to these situations they are facing increased discrimination when it comes to, as you mentioned, the digital and the green transitions. They cannot afford it, let alone because either they are not well equipped physically or intellectually with the issue, but also because I think here they have no access really to the possibility to move with those transitions, and it creates instability because it's of course insecurity for them. I think it was very clear a value, and thank you for that. And of course, I will invite to look at the very important and authoritative publication of Eurofond on the working and living conditions and improvement of those living and working conditions. Here again, is there any questions that you would like to ask to Evalio straight after his rich presentation? Not in the room here, not online. Thank you again, Evalio. Stay with us, and we will have discussions after that if time allows. But I would like to move on to Nabil. Nabil, I think we are very much interesting to look at your kind of provocative, but I think to the point report, inequality kills. And I think here, of course, and we understand the two crises have exacerbated inequalities, and this is of course one of the new factor that we have to discuss. And I would be very much interested to look into your views, in particular when you look at poverty reductions. I think this would be one element. I think the broader picture that the one we had looking at currently Europe, but also the issue of racial and gender inequalities. And of course, one dimension which is also surfacing everywhere is the threat to democracy. And of course, for the trade unions, democracy and democracy at work is of course a key features and our core business, I would say. Would be very much interested in your views. The floor is yours.
Thank you so very much, and thank you so very much to the ETUI and to everyone here. It really is a pleasure, and Oxfam, we really do value this space, and we see this as a space that brings movements together to really further equality. You've set me up very nicely actually for my presentation there, because I'd love to talk about the problem of inequality, sharing a bit about where we are right now and touching upon that. But then really deep diving into how we can reframe our understanding of inequality before touching just about what can be done. I'm just going to share my screen now, if I may, and I would love just to get a thumbs up. I can see Ivilo and others on the side. If I could get a thumbs up, if you can see my slide, that's great. We can see it. Thank you so much. So I'd love to kick off just by talking about just where we are right now, in summary. And I love to talk about the pre-pandemic world. And for those who have followed some of the big data around inequality in recent years, this bus actually became very famous because about a half decade ago, Oxfam talked about how 85 people owned more wealth than the bottom half of humanity, the bottom 3.5 billion people. And it's about 85 people that you can fit on a double-decker bus here from the UK capital in London. And that was a frightening few years. I remember the data about that. I remember standing in the snow actually in Davos and seeing the president of China relay Oxfam's data that the 1% owned more than the 99% combined, and President Obama saying that, you know, a world in which the 1% owns more than the 99% combined can never be stable. And those were the years pre-pandemic, and they were very frightening. But the reality is that the pandemic and the world that we're in right now sees very frightening levels of wealth inequality, and I'd love just to mention some of those data to help set the scene for this presentation. For example, a new billionaire has been created every 30 hours since the pandemic began. Also, at the same time, we know that over 250 million more people risk being forced into extreme poverty as these different crises converge as a result of COVID, as a result of food prices going up before Ukraine and since Ukraine, and also of inequality. We know that 99% of humanity is worse off as a result of the pandemic compared to where they would have been. We also can show here, and you can almost imagine, Oxfam, you know, we look at this billionaire wealth data very regularly, and I remember the moment sitting very alarmed around the computer screen looking at the data to see just how much billionaire wealth had risen during the pandemic, risen more in the first 24 months of COVID-19 than in 23 years combined, in those first 23 years that Forbes tracked billionaire wealth. And this is just one graph just to share with you, just to reflect upon where we are. You can see how billionaire wealth was, you know, worryingly rising in such a manner over so many years. And then you look to 2020, 2021, and the profound jump that takes place. We also know this year that billionaire wealth is fluctuating, but that trend of the massive increase during the pandemic as a whole remains, and it remains very concerning. It's also important to say, obviously, that's a global trend, but we also see it in the UK and obviously across the EU too, where billionaire wealth is up 46%. I, like many of you, enjoyed listening to Professor Piketty yesterday, who presented on a range of powerful data. One of the areas that he touched upon, and this is shared from the World Inequality Lab, which he talked about yesterday, is how, if we zoom out a little bit, you know, over this 25-year period between 1995 and 2021, the top 1% have captured more than 20 times what the bottom 50% have of global wealth growth. And I love presenting data as much as others here, but it's also important for us just to put it into human terms in terms of what we've seen during the pandemic. And just to share two reflections here. Cargill is one of the companies that's done extremely well during the pandemic. I could talk about James Cargill II, part of the 11th richest family in the world, and their family owns a majority of Cargill, which is one of 4 companies which control over 70% of the global market for agricultural commodities. Their wealth has increased by $1 million an hour since the pandemic began, and they've had a record year of profit, and it looks like it'll be the same in 2022. On the other end, we were speaking with Nelly, a school teacher in Malawi recently, and her partner's been unemployed since the start of the pandemic. She's looking after loved ones and the elderly. She actually told us recently in Malawi how the price of cooking oil has actually tripled, how she couldn't afford it. And she said in very powerful terms actually to us, "What shall I do today so we can eat?" And I wanted to share just that contrast because I think it's very important to put this into human terms. And while I want to get onto the issue of reframing inequality, and perhaps there's a moment for this in discussion, why has it grown so much during the pandemic? We know there are long-term trends at play: corporate concentration. You know, we talk about this neoliberal era. We know about market liberalization, about the decrease in progressive taxation, and of course in workers' rights. You know, and we can talk about that, but it's also important to reflect upon just how much, you know, we saw how governments necessarily, and let's say necessarily, you know, had injected cash when people needed it during the pandemic. But what we've also seen is, and I thought it was very well described in the Financial Times, how much of that stimulus went into financial markets and from there into the net worth of the ultra rich. And that's something we can perhaps dig deeper on. We also, that's happening at the top. We also know that this issue of vaccine inequality has been truly profound in exacerbating inequalities the world over. For example, the gap between rich countries and poor countries is now widening again after it was decreasing over decades. And I think that's something that Ivailo touched upon there as well. We also know how it's hit economic, but also gender inequalities when schools have been closed. For example, there's about 11 million girls at risk of not going back to school after the pandemic. And something that I think is an important discussion, especially as we look and see what's happening with inflation these past few months, is how many corporations are taking advantage of that inflationary environment to boost their profit margins. We see this across sectors. Some data, for example, from the US suggests how about 60% of inflation is being driven by corporate profits. That just sets a scene of where we are. Now, I'd love just to touch upon reframing the problem, because rightly so, we do look at inequality in terms of how it harms poverty reduction efforts. We know that the rate of poverty reduction prior to the pandemic had halved. The World Bank has, for example, provided excellent data how hundreds of millions of more people over that MDG period could have been lifted out of poverty had economic growth been shared more equally. We can talk about it in terms of workers' rights, and I'll come back to that actually. In terms of inequality leading to higher crime and less happiness and less trust in societies. But I would love just to touch upon how inequalities truly intersect. And we often talk about economic inequality, but I think we can't talk about economic inequality anymore without talking about how it relates to gender and to racial inequalities. We've heard a lot today, rightly so, about the billions of hours of unpaid care work that hold up our global economy, hold up communities and societies, that is done for free by women across the world. There's powerful data on the disproportionate impacts to women, but also the disproportionate impacts to people from racialized groups. I share a stat here from the US, how 3.4 million Black Americans would be alive today if their life expectancy was the same as white people. And that has actually shot up as a result of the pandemic. And an important part of this is, yes, understanding the impacts, of course, but it's also, I think we need to go to a deeper level of discourse here in understanding that racism and sexism and other isms that exist within our society, they're not simple irrational prejudices that exist, but they are, and we need to talk about this more, they are, as Professor Derek Hamilton describes, long leveraged strategic mechanisms for exploitation and extraction that benefit few at the expense of others. So that's one part of reframing the problem. The other part I'd love to touch upon here is climate. And climate is the biggest existential crisis that our planet faces right now. And we rightly hear how the biggest emitters and the richest countries, and it's true, are responsible disproportionately for historical and for current emissions, and that's true. But something we need to talk about far more is the role of the very rich in driving the climate crisis. Our data has shown, for example, how the world's richest 1% cause double the emissions of the poorest 50% combined. In fact, we can dive really deep here into billionaire data to show that 20 of the richest billionaires are estimated on average to be emitting as much as 8,000 times more carbon than someone from the billion poorest people. So we have to recognize how inequality, how extreme wealth is absolutely core to driving the existential climate crisis that we all face today. The third part is democracy and understanding inequality as, yes, an economic issue, but at its core is a problem of power and a problem of political capture. I share this quote from the former president of the US: "The liberty of a democracy is not safe if the people tolerate the growth of private power to a point where it becomes stronger than their democratic state itself." In fact, the former Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis famously said, we can either have extreme concentration of wealth or we can have democracy, but we can't have both. And I think that plays out at a very societal level for us to understand. But we have seen how it's been very real, this political capture, despite the democratic institutions, let's say even across the European Union, the level of political capture of decisions related to vaccine access, for example, where many rich countries, including across Europe, have really just protected pharmaceutical monopolies at the expense of our collective safety. And it's a powerful example and a frightening example of political capture at play. The final piece here in my reframing is we haven't understood inequality as a problem of harming poverty reduction, as a problem, as we've discussed, leading to unhappy, unhealthy societies. And that's true, but it goes further. Our data now shows how inequality does lead to all those things, but also inequality contributes to 1 death every 4 seconds. And we composite that data based on healthcare, based on gender-based violence, based on hunger and the climate crisis. And it's really important for us to understand here that inequality is yes a problem for the poorest people, but inequality harms us all. Inequality kills. In my closing couple of minutes that I have, and I've tried to keep to my time limit, which was generous, just to close off, is that we've heard about many important things that can be done. I'd like to just put 3 things here for our discussion here, which we see as absolutely fundamental. This current moment of crisis, but also to reversing these structural trends. Core is taxing progressively, and I always like to now provide practical examples. Argentina, for example, put in place a one-off solidarity tax, which has raised about $2.5 billion from the 10,000 richest society, put that to good use. There are examples of countries around the world doing the right thing. And the second part to this is investing in those mechanisms that we know are the most proven, the most powerful mechanisms to reduce inequality. And healthcare is absolutely core to this. Social protection, education, and we can talk about these. I share this picture actually from Costa Rica because it proves you don't have to be a rich country to be able to implement universal healthcare. And you look at the life expectancy rates, you look at the sheer power of that system. It shows and it sets an example for many, many countries. And the third thing I just want to mention here is, yes, we need to tax progressively. Yes, we need to invest that money. I think that's redistribution, and that's core. But we also need to talk more about predistribution, as my colleagues on this panel have. And this is about shifting power and income in the economy. And there are many things that be done here. Ending sexist laws. About 2.5 billion women globally don't have the same economic rights as men. And these are laws that can be changed by parliaments and by governments. And let me also say, the most powerful means here is really shoring up workers' rights that we know have been on the attack the world over. And that attack on workers' rights has been core to the increase in income and in wealth inequality. And we are living through an exciting moment. I'm from the UK, and it's amazing to see how people are really, incredibly excited by the power and the real power that the trade union movement holds as a means to redressing these deep injustices within our society. And I'll just end by saying that we need all these policies, but I think alongside that, we need a shift in imagination. And there are moments in our history after World War II, and we know about that in Europe, but also, I'm joining you here from the African continent. In many parts of the world, when developing countries broke the chains of colonialism and liberated, they implemented very progressive policies. We can take inspiration from those. Give you one example of a shift in imagination: an annual wealth tax. It's, a progressive wealth tax at the EU level would raise 424 billion euros a year. It's about 5 times the EU 7-year budget for development cooperation. It's about 140 times what the EU and member states have given to COVAX. You can read the data yourself, but we do need that shift in imagination to be able to provide the political space that recognizes the profound inequality of this moment, but also recognizes what can and what must be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nabil. I think your message has been heard, and I think it's all about the redistribution of wealth in society, and we understand it's a question of power. And I think you mentioned that quite clearly. We need a shift of power, and of course this goes to redistributions to many more people out there. And of course here we understand that it's not just about private hands leading the world, but we need to have a political will. And this political will would indeed help to have this shift in imaginations that you stress, and be sure, and I love your conclusion, be sure that the trade movement is exactly in that perspective too. And I must say that, use a quote, do not waste a good crisis. And I think we have two of them here. Independently of the adverse impact of those crises on people and the planet, I think we have to use them indeed to trigger the pace for this change that we all need. Thank you very much, Nabil. I am again here, I'm looking at the room. I think you have impressed all of our colleagues, but there is a question in the room. So a short question. And is there a question online? And I have a question online. So two short questions to you and a short answer.
Thank you. Should I stand up?
Yeah, and introduce yourself. That would be nice. Thank you.
My name is Nola. I'm an intern at EPSU. I would like to say this question is my question, just in case. Thank you for this presentation. That was really interesting, almost enraging on some points, especially the inequalities. I have kind of two questions in one, if that's okay.
Short.
Yeah, very short. So, doesn't your presentation kind of goes against the overall message of the conference that we're going towards more equality when we see that so many new billionaires were created during the pandemics? And also my second question is kind of, what can we as individuals do? Because there are a lot of recommendations and it's really interesting. And I guess most of the room is really hoping for those to be implemented, but what is there left that we can do on an individual scale, and how can we act as citizens of the world? Thank you. I know that's a very big question, so I don't know if it's possible to answer shortly.
I'm sure Nabil will be very, very short. And another question, Nabil, in a nutshell, Tamara asked, could you share an example of the progressive policies that were implemented by countries in Africa post-colonialism that we could take inspiration from? In a nutshell, 1 minute.
Thank you so much. So I'll go all three. So Tamara, great question. And there are different examples from Burkina Faso to Zambia to other places on the continent. I think the example of Zambia under the President Kenneth Kaunda is very interesting. This is not just a plug, but also an answer to your question. I co-host a podcast for Oxfam called Equals, and we actually did a deep dive on this very issue. It's on Apple Podcasts, and if you have a search there, we did an episode onto how those policies translated, for example, in better sharing the mineral wealth of that country with a far wider population. To the question in the room, thank you very, very much. The first answer is that I think there's a real question of how far we zoom out the lens, okay? Because if we're zooming in the lens right now, and I think many others do share absolute profound concern about how every inequality rises in the wake of this pandemic and the different emerging crises that we face, and that's where I'm zooming the lens right now, and I think that's where it's important. And the second part is, look, I think there are many means. Honestly, at a very, very basic level, it means winning over the people that we all know around us at the dinner table, in our friendship networks around these issues. And I think nothing beats that, and nothing beats one-to-one interaction, by the way, over even virtual means. But the other part is that there are different movements doing different work on different issues. I mean, I'm part of the People's Vaccine Alliance, for example. There's a Fight Inequality Alliance that works in countries around the world. There are different civil society organizations working on these issues. And I think there are spaces in all those organizations to find your place for action, basically. And I think the key thing is that it's never done individually, but it's always done collectively. Go alone, go fast, go together, go far.
Thank you. Watching out of the time, And having just heard that Emanuela will have to leave on time, I'm sorry, we still have 15 minutes, but watching out of the time, I would like to ask Kalian if it's okay if we leave first Emanuela for 10 minutes.
Yes,
Would that
yes, no
work
problem
you?
for me. Yeah,
That's,
it's fine.
That's lovely. Thank you very much. So I will hand over straight away to Emanuela, also to have a gender perspective from the ILO. So Emanuela, to have the floor. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and thank you for also allowing me to speak
Could
earlier.
you be closer to your mic, because we can't
Can
hear
you
you?
hear me well? Can you hear me well? Hello, can you hear me well?
A bit better.
Ah, okay.
Lovely. Now it's lovely. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So thank you very much for allowing me to speak earlier. And sorry, but I really have to leave to another meeting. So thank you also for this invitation to join on a conversation on inequality that, I mean, as it has already been said, it's clearly a very complex and multifaceted problem. And with COVID-19, we all know that this unprecedented crisis, economic and social crisis, has deepened some of the inequalities in many countries. We have seen the difficulties of countries in absorbing external shocks and the unequal ability of governments to put in place the needed public services and health measures. And we have seen how workers in insecure forms of work and informal economy, especially women and the disadvantaged groups, have been disproportionately affected and harmed by income loss and by other negative effects. And so the type and extent of inequalities we know vary by country and over time. But when we talk about gender inequalities, despite some progress over the past decades, we see that gender inequalities remain persistent and pervasive. And in many cases, COVID-19, the crisis has reversed some of women's gains especially in the world of work. And so just to give few numbers, which are at global level, the pandemic has caused unprecedented losses in jobs and working hours, especially for women. Between 2019 and 2020, 3.6% of women's employment was destroyed relative to 2.9% of men. And this is largely due to the impact of lockdowns, as we know, that have affected sectors, those sectors where women were overrepresented. And where there was also a lot of informal working arrangements. Now, a category of women that suffer the most is actually mothers. Mothers of young children were the most affected by job losses, and fathers the least. And in 2020, 2 million mothers left the labor force due to the additional demands for unpaid care. In 2021, there were still 20 million fewer women in employment compared to 2019. And in high-income countries, we see that women and men are experiencing a strong recovery in hours worked, while in low and middle-income countries, the gender gap is still larger than in 2019. And all of this leaves a gender gap in labor force participation of 25.3 percentage points, which is forecasted for 2022. And so we all know that the gender pay gap remains very high. At global level is 19%. And the undervaluation of women's work is particularly ingrained in the most needed health and social work sectors, where we have 70% of the workforce that is actually women. We clearly have seen, and this was already mentioned, the disproportionate time that is spent by women on housework and family care. And to address all these problems, there is a need for more investment in the care sector. Also, Nabil mentioned this. We need greater availability of family-related leave policies in the form of maternity, paternity, parental, and other care leave-related policies, as well as child and elderly care services that can redistribute unpaid care work between women and men, but also between the home, the family, and the state. And while care leave policies are not necessarily very expensive, clearly childcare and elderly care services is actually what is more expensive. And this is where countries are not investing enough. And according to the ILO's latest report on Care Act work, we see that there have been improvements in some care leave policies. For instance, we have 120 countries where maternity leave is longer and better paid compared to 2011. And we also see that there is a rise in interest in recognizing the role of paternity. So we have 115 countries that are providing paternity leave, and 33 of these countries actually have introduced some forms of paternity leave during the past few years. So that's a good sign. But as a matter of fact, 649 million women, many of whom are actually self-employed, have inadequate or no maternity protection at all. And over 1 billion men live in countries where there is no entitlement to paternity leave. And where this entitlement exists, it's usually very short, it's poorly paid, and the take-up is very low. And one of the biggest challenges that we see is this childcare policy gap, which is basically the gap between the moment when leave policies like maternity, paternity, and parental end, and the moment where countries offer childcare. This gap is actually of 4 years. And this is a time where basically parents just need to find alternative arrangements. And many of these alternative arrangements actually imply that women, mothers quit their work, or they enter part-time or informal types of working arrangements. And of course, for countries where societies are aging, and aging societies is a problem, the situation is further compounded by care demands from dependent older parents and family members with disability. And long-term care services remain inaccessible and inadequate to the great majority, putting at risk families in terms of income poverty and financial hardship. So to reverse this widening of gender inequalities, we do need a continuum of care leave policies and care services for the best early start for children, to enable working parents, especially working mothers, to enter, remain, and progress in the labor market. And we estimated that the investment case is very straightforward. We could create 300 million decent jobs by 2035 through an annual investment equivalent to 4.2% of total annual GDP. It is a lot of money, yes, indeed, but an increase in tax revenue from the additional earnings and employment would also offset the cost in part. And so if we do want to have a gender transformative agenda realized, we need investments. And these investments should really be directed, as Nabil said, towards universal access to comprehensive and adequate social protection for all, and implementation of employment policies that have a focus on women, which are key to promoting the recovery of sectors that have been hardly hit by the pandemic. I'll stop here, but clearly the promotion of equal pay for work of equal value is essential to reduce inequality, gender inequalities, as well as preventing, addressing, and eliminating violence and harassment in the world of work. And clearly all of this needs to be looked as a nexus with climate change. So the care and climate change nexus and just transition are extremely important. There's no time to elaborate on that, but I think it's very in line with what Nabil was also discussing. And I thank you very much for this opportunity.
Emanuela, thank you very much. I think we got two messages clearly here. What as additional information, the first one is that gender inequality is systemic, and the second one is that the gender transformative agenda will be an investment with return. And I think this is exactly what we see from the figures. If we do this investment, the return will be much higher. And indeed, we have some tools out there that are already existing. You mentioned the issue of work-life balance, maternity leave, already very much anchored in some countries and legislations, in other not. And I think this is one of the many solutions out there. Of course, the issue of investment in care is clear, and the value of the unpaid care work is also something that is important. On the top of, I would say, to the pay transparency. Of course, this is one of the key elements. Thank you very much, Emanuela. I look if there is any question. No question in the room, no question line. So thank you very much, Emanuela. And without further ado, I hand over to, after this focus on the international dimension, coming back to the European with Kalyan, and handing over to you, Kalyan.
Thank you so much, and good morning to you all. And thank you very much for inviting me to this interesting conference, and also to giving a little wrap up at the beginning, so that I also got the flavor of the discussions you had before this session today. In my intervention, I will touch upon, let's say, problems, but I will also try to give solutions, because I strongly believe that we should also look at possible solutions to overcome inequality. And let me start by saying that listening to the previous speakers and also hearing what was shared in the previous days, I strongly believe that we can tackle inequality if we work together. There's a wealth of information and energy in many organizations, citizens, different stakeholders, but we tend to work a little bit in silos. So I think that working more closely together would be a really good and strong point. Let me say at the same time that I know that achieving overcoming inequality, it's not easy, because it's not a new concept. Inequality has been around in some form or other for thousands of years. And this may lead some people to think that maybe inequality is inevitable, that human beings are unequal by nature. And similar arguments have been made about gender equality throughout human history. Gender norms and ideas about how women and men should be and act are internalized early in life. And these ideas are so strong that many do not remember to recognize them for what they truly are: ideas, social constructions. And an example that we are seeing now is these anti-gender narratives and strategies based on conceptions on how women and men indeed should be and should act. We have made astonishing progress in the last 50 or so years, unraveling piece by piece these structural biases about gender roles that are embedded deep, as I said, within our societies. But we have a way to go. And I will now give you 3 examples of how gender inequality continues to cost us all. First, it was already mentioned, the gender pay gap. The gender pay gap shows that society continues to undervalue women's work throughout all areas of the economy. And I don't want to overburden you with data, but to give you a statistic in this area, our data shows that in workplaces dominated by men, women are paid 30% less than men for the same work. The continued existence of this gender pay gap means that these ideas about what women's work looks like and how we should value it are still widespread in the workplace. And this leads me to my second topic, care. It was already mentioned, and we know that care responsibilities exploded during COVID pandemic. But you know, care responsibilities should never cause anyone to leave their jobs against their will, but they do. Though the individual circumstances are different, for 7.7 million women across the European Union, the end result is the same. Caring responsibilities force them to leave their jobs, and this is compared to 400,000 men. From an equality perspective, nobody should be forced to give up their jobs for caring responsibilities in the first place. But from a gender equality perspective, we really need to ask why so many of these people ended up being women. because everybody should be entitled to choose how they live their life, whether that be working, caring, or a mix of both. However, more often than not, this is not the reality, as my data show. And then I come to my third point, COVID-19. It was mentioned already, this pandemic disproportionately hit women. And women are still feeling the after effects. Lockdowns led domestic violence to spike. Sectors, such as hospitality and retail, staffed mostly by women, saw huge job losses. And during the pandemic, home and work merged into one. And we already spoke about the spike in care responsibilities. COVID recovery plans must factor in these differences. And this is why the data collecting by institutions such as EIGE and Eurofound are so important. They tell governments where to direct recovery funds so that the people who need support the most get it. And the good news is that EU policymakers are working hard to counter the negative effects of the pandemic. They realize the opportunity that Build Back plans have to not only redress gender equality setbacks, but to advance it. The Recovery and Resilience Facility includes a requirement for EU member states to show how their national plans will advance gender equality. And this is where the important role played by trade unions comes in. Trade unions across the European Union pushed hard for including gender perspectives in recovery plans, placing women's rights and working conditions high on the agenda. Without the collective bargaining power of trade unions, gender equality could never have improved at the speed that it has. Without trade unions, women would not have maternity rights and men would not have paternity rights. And the gender pay gap would have been much, much wider than it is now. So again, we have made incredible progress in gender equality, but there is still a way to go. And let me tell you about 3 steps we can take right now. The first step, gender pay gap. We must work to close this gap. And the EU recently announced a landmark deal on women on company boards, meaning that more women than ever will get their seat at the decision-making table in companies across the European Union. This is an incredible step forward for gender equality and will further help break down gender norms about what women's work should look like. A second step we could take, and that's for care. During the pandemic, although the care load for women exploded, men doubled their share of childcare. Very positive news. And our data has shown that when employers offer time-off bonuses to fathers, their use of parental leave increases significantly. A step in this direction will mean structural biases that end up placing care responsibilities on will be further broken down. And then a third step that could be taken, recovery. Already several member states have submitted recovery plans that factor in the pandemic's disproportionate effects on women. And I will mention you a few examples that might inspire you. Spain introduced a reform to compensate parents, primarily mothers, for the cost of a birth and childcare in order to reduce the gender pension gap. Belgium invested in housing for vulnerable persons, including women or victims of violence. And then, last but not least, Austria promoted reskilling and upskilling of workers, offering extra funding to ensure flexible training methods to focus on supporting women. These plans can serve to inspire all EU member states to continue to include gender perspectives, not only in their recovery plans, but in their annual national budgets. We've already come this far. Now, together we need to take 3 steps forward for a more gender equal world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kalina. I think your message and also the focus on Europe is much appreciated to wrap up and end up these sessions this morning. And thank you again for making these three suggestions or even implementing the developments or at the EU level in terms of closing the gender gap. Of course, looking at what's happening at the member states level in terms of reforms, indeed, to stress and to stop to stress the inequality, but to stop those inequality in terms of policies. I think much appreciated in that. Watching out of the time, I'm looking at the room. Is there any questions to Kalien? Yeah, you have a question. So my colleague is quickly running to hand over the mic to Ilaria. and thank you for allowing for 5 minutes more for the short discussion. Yes. Ilaria.
Ilaria Costantini from ETUI. Well, I would like to thank the speaker for finally mentioning violence against women. This is like the worst impact that inequality could have if we speak about gender. I just would like to know what kind of research has been done on that without developing too much, but just to know where to find more. Thanks.
Kalien?
Yes, well, thank you. Thank you for this question. And indeed, I touched briefly upon this issue, but it's actually one of the main topics that EIGE is working on. So if you go to our website, you will see a lot of administrative data that we collected. You will also see that EIGE is currently working on cyber violence and femicide. And of course, the first step that we need to take is to come up with a definition that can be used throughout the European Union. And also after having defined such a definition that can be used by all member states so that we all speak about the same thing. We usually develop indicators that can be used by member states to collect their own data. There was a lot of talk about the costs of inequality and the costs of gender inequality. EIGE recently published a report on the costs of gender-based violence. And to give you an astonishing figure that came out of this, we estimated that gender-based violence costs the European Union, and this is apart from, of course, the human tragedy and the fact that people are suffering from this. It costs the European Union 366 billion euros per year. And you know, sometimes I'm really astonished at these figures, and I don't want to touch only upon, of course, the economic costs because it's a human tragedy. But why don't policymakers, why don't they wake up? I mean, if we need to come out of this financial crisis, again, EIGE keeps providing this data to show not only the human tragedy, but also the huge economic cost that gender equality has on our societies and on the European Union. And a last word, because this is really a topic dear to my heart, EIGE and the Fundamental Rights Agency are actually doing a second survey now on violence against women. You might remember that FRA did the first one in 2014. We're now doing a second survey also together with Eurostat. And the results of that survey, in which women are interviewed throughout the European Union, the results will be available in 2024. We have to have a little bit of patience because it's a huge survey. But so on one hand, we gather data and information, we give advice to member states how to deal with this issue, and we keep calculating the costs to wake up policy makers in the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kalien, for this input. And I would like also here to recall that the ETUC is calling for the ratification of the Istanbul Convention of the Council of Europe. So I think here, indeed, closing the loop. And thank you again for that last focus on the fight against violation. The fight against violence against women and domestic violence. So, colleagues, thank you very much for this very rich and again here inspiring input this morning. Contribution from the working group up to opening to very high-level speakers with very rich contributions, looking at Europe, looking at the international dimensions, looking at different focuses from women to racial discriminations, looking also at the solutions. And I think this is also what I would like to stress in a nutshell to wrap up and then leave you for a well-deserved coffee break. I think we have here the clear dimension of the cost of inequality in terms of figures, but also in terms of messages. The first one is, of course, and I would like to recall what Nabil said, is that indeed inequality harms us all, and I think this is an element that we have to take on board. It's not just certain group out there. It's a danger, and I think this is the last message we heard. There is a danger that inequality has been internalized, that we think is there and it will stay, and it's a kind of, you have to do with it. And I think this is something we cannot accept, and this is exactly what the trade unions has never accepted. And here I would like to recall the many mobilizations and successes of those mobilizations in terms of fixing in legislations and also via collective agreements, workers' rights when it comes to equal pay, but when it comes to working time and paid holiday, just to name but a few things. The cost of inequality is huge, and we've seen that. The good news out there is that we need investment to stop this inequality, but the investment is worthwhile because we have seen how much indeed we could indeed gain in terms of return if we would need to have more economic evidence and arguments to move on. What we also have heard, and I think this is more the quantitative that I would like to stress, but the qualitative dimension of the cost of inequality is what we've seen. The cost of inequality is exacerbated by the two crises, is the rise in work poverty, it's the rise of insecurity, which leads to social unrest. It's also the rise of and the use by political extremes and non-democratic forces of these fears and insecurity. And then I think here, what we have not touched upon today, but what is also behind the scene is the development of xenophobia, is the development of racism. And I think here we saw it, I would say, in the US much more prominently than we might have seen here in Europe. But I think this is something that we have to fight against. And here again, the ETUC has put in place a plan, a roadmap, how to fight far rights, in particular because, and this is the last point, this is a real threat to democracy. And I think it all boils down to the promotions and the protection of our values. And of course, this is where the trade union movement works. And this is the core of the work, and the mission of the trade union is, of course, to exercise democracy at the workplace, to make sure that every worker is a citizen of his company, but also to make sure that the exercise of the workplace as an educational means is, of course, paving the way for the engagements in the political development of a country, of society, and to prevent abstention. We have to use this crisis, which triggers, of course, a change of paradigms. We have seen it with the COVID-19 crisis. We see it with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. I think we see a change in the rules we have fixed, being the taxations or the tax rules, the fiscal rules at the European level. We have even rethought Schengen, and I think this is also something we have to take into account. We are in a time where we can make those changes, and where we have to make clear, and that will be my conclusions, here what matters is the people and the planet, potentially much more than the economy, but the economy is a mean, and we understood that from Thomas Piketty yesterday. Taxation and progressive taxation is the way is one of the many way out, and I would like to add to that, regulations is one of the other means out, in particular when it is based on strong collective agreement negotiated and concluded by trade unions. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for your questions, and go to a well-deserved coffee and a coffee break now. Thank you.